Okay, folks, today's presentation is called The Director is Not Always Right, and we're dealing with the subject of director's cuts. Now, the director's cut is something that I think kind of came into the public cognizance with the movie Blade Runner. Now, Blade Runner has had a few different versions, and one of which was called the director's cut, which was Ridley Scott's vision of the film, and there's been a lot of discussion about which version of the film is best, theatrical release, director's cut. I think there's even been a cut or two after that. We got further and further into the director's cut hole after the release of the incredibly bad movie Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, which a lot of people argued was bad because there had been several edits made to the movie, largely to shrink it in terms of time, because it was an excessively long movie already, but there were still some minutes that were excised by the editors on account of thinking, well, this doesn't really add that much to the plot. But I've actually heard from people who have watched what is now called the Snyder Cut of the movie. It was directed by Zack Snyder, that the outtakes or the excised scenes from Batman v Superman actually do help in some ways to keep the narrative on track in a way that the theatrical release doesn't. And I just remember walking out of the theatrical release, not early, but after the movie was over, just shaking my head at just how bad that movie was. But from also what I've heard, it's not like the Snyder Cut actually put a whole lot of important stuff back into the movie, so I'm really not certain. I have to watch the Snyder Cut someday. I'd really like to, but at this point it's just not one of my high goals. But because of this, because there was the whole release the Snyder Cut thing, that carried over into Zack Snyder's next movie, Justice League, which was taken over by Joss Whedon after Zack Snyder's family had a personal family crisis. I believe they had a death in the family, and so he was not able to finish the movie as he intended. That didn't happen until this cut years later, which premiered on HBO Max. And so I think we've gotten down the rabbit hole with regard to director's cuts, even to the point where it went and extended to the next big DC movie, which was Suicide Squad. People were soon clamoring for the release of the Ayer cut, which would feature Jared Leto, and I think a more prominent position as the Joker, and I don't know what other scenes it's supposed to add, but the whole point is that we've gotten this notion that the director is always right, and this continues even today. To a recent post by Frank Grillo, the actor who played Brock Rumlow in Captain America: The Winter Soldier and Captain America: Civil War. He's recently debuted a movie called Cop Shop, in which he appears beside Gerard Butler, and he has a specific complaint about how his character was affected by the studio's editing of the movie. Now, he and director Joe Carnahan apparently had a different vision for the film than the studio had, and so the studio made edits that Frank Grillo was not pleased with at all. And so he voiced his opposition. Well, not opposition, he's still promoting the movie, but he's basically saying, if I look bad, it's not the fault of me, it's not the fault of the director, blame the studio editing. And so we're kind of getting this idea into the public consciousness that, studios are bad, studios don't know what they're doing, and the director is always right. But that's just not true. And I think one of the best examples of how that's not true comes from an older sci-fi movie called Highlander. I did a video on this earlier, but I want to focus on this movie for the purpose of showing how sometimes the studio knows what it's doing when it takes scenes and such that are superfluous or confusing out of the film. Because this is something I didn't know until I recently watched Highlander, and I watched Highlander, the director's cut. I didn't even know there was a director's cut of this film until last month. I grew up in, this film debuted in like 1985, and I grew up on the version that came out then in the U.S., and in U.S. theaters and on U.S. cable stations, they played a reduced version of the film. Not reduced by much. There was only 8 minutes of footage that was cut from the movie. But as I think you'll see here, not only were the cuts significant, but I think they were also justified, even though the director was against those cuts. So, spoilers for the movie Highlander are coming, so if you have not seen the movie, I highly recommend it. If you're an Amazon Prime member, you can get this movie for free. So go over, watch Highlander, come back, and we can go over what you saw, and I can tell you about some of the scenes that if you were watching this movie in the United States in 1985, you wouldn't have seen, and with good reason. Now, Highlander, spoilers ahead now, is the story of Connor MacLeod, a 16th century Scotsman who finds out after suffering a fatal wound in a clan versus clan battle, not like Big K clan, I'm talking about Scottish clans, that he's immortal, that he cannot die unless his head is severed from his neck. And so he basically goes throughout history in various sword fights, and the goal is to be the last immortal standing. And he has a mentor portrayed by Sean Connery, who is the first Egyptian, Spaniard, Scottish guy who's ever been on camera. So if he looks a little over the top, that segues nicely into the first category of scenes that I want to group together, these scenes that were excised from Highlander against the director's will. So this grouping is called a little bit over the top. Now these are going to be scenes where something happens that's just, it doesn't add so much as it distorts, as much as it pulls you in a direction you don't really need to go. So, for example, in the very first few minutes of the film, you have Connor MacLeod facing off against another immortal named Faisal, and they're doing a sword fight in the parking garage, and at one point, Connor MacLeod loses his sword, and he's got to go chasing after it. Now, at that point, Faisal is looking for him, and as he looks for him, now, keep in mind, this is set in the present day, or at least what was present day, 1985, and you've got two guys having a sword fight in the parking garage of Madison Square Garden. This film is already weird. Weirdness you don't need on top of that is this Faisal guy all of a sudden doing backflips over and over and over and over throughout the parking garage looking for MacLeod. Backflips? Really? I mean, for one thing, the guy's fighting with a sword. Where's his sword now? But another thing is, we don't really need this to show any more weirdness than we're already experiencing. I mean, there's just a little bit of over the top to a guy all of a sudden doing tumbling moves throughout a parking garage when they're already holding this sword fight. So that's one example. Another example comes in a flashback scene. You have Connor MacLeod, who's just suffered the fatal wound that will soon reveal that he is immortal. It looks like he's dying, but after a while, he's up hale and hearty again, and no one knows what to make of this. In fact, he's accused of being in league with the devil by his cousins and by the woman in the tavern. So he is basically run out of town on a rail. He's strapped to a tree branch that is binding his arms, and he's being pelted with stones and attacked by various people as he leaves the village, never to return. But there's a scene in here where this crazy MF, he goes and just headbutts Connor MacLeod 3 times. And apparently this is some, Scottish joke that the American editors were kind of like, I don't think Americans are necessarily going to get this. There's either some sort of custom or some sort of joke that's embedded in this triple headbutt thing, and they're like, yeah, let's just go ahead and take that out. And it's a good thing that they did, because it's just one of these things where it's like, he's way too into it. I mean, you kind of get this sensation that this guy is just gleefully headbutting MacLeod. It doesn't really make any sense, and so it's a good thing that scene was dropped as well. There's another flashback scene, which was actually a funny scene, where MacLeod has insulted this guy's wife, and so he's been challenged, this is back in Victorian times or Elizabethan times, I don't know which, to a traditional duel. And MacLeod, drunk off his ass, is getting stabbed several times by this guy, and each time McCloud gets up and he's like, hey, let's do that again. And being immortal, of course, he's not going to get killed by any of this. So this happens about 6 or 7 times until McCloud finally says, okay, I'm sorry I called your wife a bloated warthog. And then he walks off, and it's just a funny scene, that illustrates McCloud's immortality. Now, what was taken out in the American version was a little bit of follow-up to this scene, where the duelist against whom McCloud was facing off is so pissed off at what happened that he decides to shoot his dueling second. And now the scene has just kind of taken a darker turn, because now this is not just McCloud suffering several stab wounds from his own, boorish behavior and having to get back up again time and time again because he's an immortal. It's no longer a funny scene. It's now more of a tragic scene, because now you just have this guy take out his anger on somebody else. It's kind of like, here's McCloud not dealing with the consequences of his own stupid behavior. It tarnishes the scene's comedy, and it really needed to be removed. And then last but not least, we have the church scene where McCloud encounters his age-old enemy, the Kurgan, played by Clancy Brown, who is now the voice of Mr. Krabs on SpongeBob SquarePants. And Clancy Brown, when he's done taunting McCloud, starts taunting some of the priests and the nuns in the Catholic Church that they've entered. And at one point, Clancy Brown basically makes obeisance to the priest, saying, I'm a worm, and I'm just, I'm terrible. And then he walks off and, does a little bit more grandstanding. But in the director's cut, Clancy Brown actually goes so far as to lick the priest's hand, which is just kind of disgusting. I mean, this guy's already displayed enough disgusting behavior. It doesn't really need to go this far. So this was another scene that I think that the studio editors judiciously extracted from the American version. Now, the second category that I want to bring up is that of Connor's women. Now, of course, we know back in, well, if you've seen the movie, we know back in the 16th century that Connor was in love with his wife Heather, whom he met after he was driven out of the village. But did you know that there was, in fact, a love interest of his before he left the village? Well, if you remember the scene where you had the woman caressing his face at the time that he was dying of his fatal stab wound, you might not realize this is the same woman who later goes on to accuse him of sorcery and being in league with the devil once he comes back to life. This woman is actually a love interest of his, and we don't really know this unless we see the director's cut, in which there is a scene of the McClouds all going off to battle, the battle in which Connor will receive his fatal stab wound, and she runs up alongside his horse and kisses him and asks the cousins to bring him back in one piece, and the cousins jokingly say, well, we know which piece you mean. So apparently this was a love interest, or at least a sex interest, of Connor McCloud back in the 16th century. And the problem with it is it kind of clouds up his romantic narrative. Now he doesn't just lose Heather later in the film because of her age, because she ages and dies while he remains immortal, but he also loses this woman due to his immortality because she shuns him for presumably being in league with Satan. So it kind of doubles up on the tragedy in a way that is superfluous. Back when it's just, okay, here's some random woman in the bar who thinks that he's in league with the devil, and you don't really connect her with the woman who caresses his face because there's like 15 minutes between flashback scenes. This isn't like one continuous flashback sequence. So it's easy to disconnect the two, and so it's easy to relegate her to a position of relative unimportance other than the accusations that she makes against him. So having her as a love interest in the 1600s on top of, or the 1500s if that's 16th century, on top of Heather really kind of clouds his earlier narrative, and I'm glad that they took out that scene. Next, you have another woman who is not I wouldn't say sweet on McCloud necessarily, but very protective of him. It's his secretary, Rachel Ellenstein. Rachel Ellenstein doesn't really appear in the film that much, but you kind of get the impression that number one, she knows of his immortality. And number two, she's been around him a long, long time. And the tender way in which they have a parting finally towards the end of the movie, where he's got to go off and rescue his present-day love interest, Brenda, pictured here in the middle and played by Roxanne Hart. You get the impression that maybe they had some sort of relationship once upon a time, and or that they tried to have a relationship once upon a time, but things just didn't work out. And you don't really know what the whole relationship is, but it's just kind of a nice little sweet and tender thing. Except if you see the director's cut, in which case you find out that Rachel is actually a little girl that Connor MacLeod finds during the Nazi persecution of the Jews in the 40s. So this girl, Rachel, this woman, Rachel, is actually Connor MacLeod's adopted daughter. But you never see that kind of relationship between the two in the movie, within the scope of the movie. You never get any kind of father-daughter vibe going on between them. And it's just weird when you finally see this after if you've seen the American version and you've already just come to the conclusion, well, maybe he's a woman that he's worked alongside, or who knows his secret for some reason, and maybe she wanted to fall in love with him, but he just wasn't into her, or he was too closed off, or what have you. But then to find out in the director's cut that she's practically his daughter, that's just, you don't. How do you have a story about an immortal who's having trouble connecting with people down through the years, which is part of the Highlander mythos here, is that he's having, after losing Heather, he really hasn't been able to connect with people after that, and yet have him adopt a little girl? It really just doesn't make sense. You can't really connect those dots unless, it's been like a horribly emotionally distant relationship over however many years. It's been 40 plus years that she's been in his care. It's just, this was a convolution that I am glad that they left out in the American version. And then last but not least, we have his current day love interest, Brenda, who, after he stabs himself to prove his immortality, naturally they fall into bed, because obviously seeing somebody's blood gush out makes you want to see more bodily fluids gushing, or some such logic like that. Do see my earlier video for what I think is a more plausible explanation of why she would fall into bed with him afterwards. But in the American version, after you see this sex scene, then it cuts immediately to her going back to her apartment and running into the Kurgan, who then kidnaps her and leads MacLeod into the fight at the end. But in the director's cut, there's actually a scene that takes place between the sex scene and the Kurgan meeting up with her on the stairs to her apartment. And that is this scene in the zoo, where MacLeod basically tells her, this really isn't going to work. I'm still, too messed up. I'm too distant. I'm too, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, yeah, okay, I get it. And then she leaves. And off you see the Kurgan in the distance, who's watching them. And this is how he knows to follow her back to her place. But, we don't actually need this scene. And the problem with this scene is that it takes us out of the relationship and out of MacLeod's growth, MacLeod's personal growth as being able to make connections again. I mean, the fact that he fell into bed with this woman after revealing his immortality to her kind of says, hey, I'm willing to give life a chance now. And I'm willing to experience love again now. And I'm going to have good things in my life now. Which is why it's all the more dramatic when the Kurgan shows up to take all that away from him again. But if he's already kind of sent her off, that diminishes her value to him as being who he is going to invest himself in. And if he can't invest himself in her, then why should we? So this again was a good choice, and it's not really mattering much as far as, you know, how is it that the Kurgan actually managed to get ahead of Brenda and actually find her at her apartment. I mean, maybe this is some scene that took place a week later after McLeod and her had been seeing her. Or had been seeing each other several times. You don't know, and you don't have to know. By this point in the movie, we're just kind of ready for it to be over because it's already gone for about, you know, an hour and a half by now. So this is kind of, it's just kind of a superfluous scene to have this meet up at the zoo and try to establish a timeline sort of connection, and also having McLeod push her away. So I just basically wanted to make this video to show you that the director is not always right. The director's vision of the film is not always the right vision for that film. Directors, you know, like Russ, I believe his name's Russell McKay, who actually did a really good job of directing Highlander, I have to say. He was a music video director before he did Highlander. I think Highlander may have been his first feature film. It is excellently directed. It's very expertly directed. And so I have to give the director a lot of acclaim for making Highlander the movie that it is. But I don't agree with his poo-pooing on the editorial choices that American editors made to turn Highlander into the grand theatrical release that it actually became. So, so that is my video, and in the next video, I actually do intend to take on what is often called the worst sequel of all time, which is Highlander 2. So do join me for that video when we take a look at Highlander 2, the Renegade cut. I think it's also kind of a director's cut thing. I don't really remember the older version that well, so this isn't going to be a comparison so much. But we are going to analyze this movie, and we're going to talk about whether it's actually as bad as everyone says. It kind of is, but it kind of didn't have to be. So please join me for that one. I'm Mike Partika. Thanks for watching this video, and I will talk to you later.